sugarcoating, no spin, taking the hard knocks. We're learning from failure so you can succeed. This is the Failosophy audio and video cast with Gabe Zichermann.
In the time of chimpanzees, I was a monkey. Butane in my veins and a mouth that kept the junkie.
And we are live on the Failosophy web and audio cast. Hello, everybody. Welcome, Facebook family. So good to see you. Every week or so, with an exception for the end of year holidays, I come to you with an interesting conversation about failure. Failosophy, as you probably know, is this idea that we can actually learn to fail better. And the origins of it are that, recently I had to shut down a startup called Onward that I'd worked on for many years and raised a bunch of venture capital and brought in many of my friends and like long-term business partners as investors and so on, and we were working on a solution for digital addiction. And I had to shut the company down. And during that process, I realized that it really sucked. I was really, really, really drug under and sad, and just didn't feel very good about anything. And then it occurred to me that I've co-founded 5 companies so far, maybe a 6th, depending on how you want to count it. I've co-founded 5 companies, and of those 5 companies, 3 have been failures. They're out of business, they didn't work out. 4 if we go with 6. And 2 of them have been successes. And so the weird observation that I made was, coming into Onward after all this experience, I'm in my mid-40s, I've done this multiple times. Why is it that I don't, why is it that I don't have any perspective? Why am I unable to actually make this failure experience less painful? Why haven't I learned anything from all those failures? And that's what kicked off this whole process of thinking about, Failosophy in a way of approaching failure as a skill set that people and organizations can learn, and people can apply, sort of in their own life. And this week, I've spent a lot of time thinking about relationships and thinking about how my personal relationships have, the ones that have failed, which is all of them except for the current one, my personal relationships have been, and how those failures have actually gone for me, and whether or not I'm really learning lessons. And I realized that every time, my current relationship, my partner's a really awesome guy, we have had a bunch of conflicts, and that conflict, is complicated, and I won't go into it now in too much detail. But many of those fights, as we sort of like dug in and I've looked at myself, many of these conflicts, many of these things are actually repeats of conflicts that I had in the past. They're re-litigating subjects that I thought I had put to bed and I thought that I had litigated. And the thing that I realized was, asking myself the question, what's holding me back? Why can't I actually get better at this relationship thing, I guess, over time? And I realized that really it was about honesty. Was I actually able to, at the end of a relationship, look back on it and say, oh, these are the real and honest reasons why this didn't work out. Here's what I did wrong. Here's what the other person did wrong. This is how I would do this again if things were different. Instead of just being like, I think it's good to feel free and empowered in the process of making a decision like that to end a relationship. And of course, the temptation is always to cast the other person, as the villain, or to, if you're self-critical like me, cast yourself as the villain. But a lack of honesty, a lack of ability to kind of turn an eye to the substance of the experience and make that something that you learn from, I think really holds me back. And so one of my core beliefs and my core commitments to myself and by extension to all of you is that, we are going to have a very honest and unvarnished and completely spin-free, look at failure. And, spin is a big problem. We learn early on that we're supposed to spin our failures, from the earliest case studies of, relationships falling apart. I think for many people, we weren't really, she wasn't great or he wasn't great. We drifted apart. That's my favorite one. that really doesn't mean anything at all. And similarly, in the context of your professional life, the failures that you might have require some honesty. They require some clarity. And so, as usual, I have a guest on the show this week, and he and I have known each other for a number of years. And one of the things that always struck me about my guest is that he was always very honest and able to be very vulnerable, even in quickly, like early on in getting to know me. And he's the sort of classic definition of a mensch. He's not the only one, but certainly a classic definition. And so, very excited to have my friend Josh Konowe on the show. Hello.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Great. How are you? Thanks so much, Gabe.
Oh my God, so exciting! I could not have been more excited by your agreeing to come on and talk with us.
Thank you, and welcome to your mid-40s along with me. So
yeah, thank you so much. I feel like we're keeping it together. Look at us.
Yeah, we are. We are.
You know what it is? It's the round face.
It is, and the well-groomed top of the head.
Yeah. It's become very fashionable. Yeah, it's funny actually that you bring that up, and I want to let you introduce yourself to people in a minute. And just for reference, if you can't see it, you follow me on Twitter at GZICHERM, and you can follow Josh at JKONOWE. So, I used to view losing my hair when my dad didn't have a lot of hair. Already by the time I was a kid, and they were quite young when they had me. And I always viewed that as like impending doom,
Yes, you've reached the end.
Yes, exactly. Like, I'm going to lose all my hair. Like, not knowing how the science of all of this works, I was kind of like, okay, someday I'm going to lose all my hair. And because I had like literally 24 years to contemplate whether or not I would have hair, by the time I got to the age where my hair actually started to sort of recede, I was completely at peace with it. I talked about it a lot. I joked about it a lot. And I made myself a personal commitment where I said, okay, every time I go in for a haircut, I'm going to ask my hairstylist, how's the hair doing? Am I balding yet? And as soon as she does, and I remember having this conversation, with I used to go to fancy salons because I liked the experience. And I had this conversation with my hairstylist, and every week it would be like, oh, no, things are fine. And then there was one haircut where she was like, well, and I was like, okay, this has been great. And that's the last time I, went to a salon, and that was it, because I had a lot of time to kind of, think through how I would deal with.
I was in hair denial, I think, for a very long period of time. It was a rough psychological period for me.
Hair denial.
Yeah, it's a new thing.
Yeah, it's the worst thing. And I want to say hello to some of the people who are watching us right now who've chimed in. JP, Shane, Jane, lovely to see all of you. Thanks for being here live. Of course, you can also listen to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts, which is a cute saying. Okay, so Josh, for people who don't know you,
Sure.
Tell folks a little bit about what it is that you do and how you identify.
Sure. So I'm an early stage entrepreneur, which means I've, breathed failure in and out of my lungs more than most human beings. And prior to that, I was in ad sales up and down Madison Avenue in New York. And I've had two relatively good moments and two really, really bad ones. And that failure, or those failures, whatever you want to call them, are usually the things that kind of stay with you. The successes are sort of anticlimactic, at least in our space in technology, and short-lived, and then everybody forgets you, and because their feed tells them something else is going on.
Right.
And, you have to go back and go make some more noise again. So I think I've only come to terms with failure both in my professional and personal life more recently in the last, let's say, 5 to 7 years, where I've not just accepted it and embraced it and all those kinds of things, but what do I take away from it and how do I get better? So that's a little bit about me.
Why was it hard, or what was it about the last 5 to 7 years that changed your inquiry?
So the arc of my personal life probably affected my business life just as much as anything else, and I'm a divorcee, so that impacts you. And even as you stated earlier, when you have these kind of failed relationships, I think you don't really look at the aggregate of your relationships, which is failure, 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 success, and it's really success for a period of time,
Right.
and then failure, failure, failure again, and again, hopefully some more success as you keep going through that process. And the immaturity of being a 25-year-old getting married and just saying, wasn't me, right, is a lot easier to pass by yourself without any retrospection. But at 39, when you're signing, divorce paperwork, you might want to start to look around the room a little bit more and go, maybe I had something to do with this, what that might be.
Yeah, is that related, do you think, not to generalize beyond
Sure.
your personal experience, but do you think that's related to is that a sense of mortality? Is it based on the experience that you've built up where you're able to be more honest? I mean, certainly there's a idea that, like, very old people are super honest, because
Right.
honey badger don't give a fuck, and neither did my grandparents. But
Well said.
so some of that might be aging, but do you think there's something else going on there?
I think there is, because the reality is you're going to keep having, the realization for me at least was, I will keep failing at whatever relationships I decide to have afterwards if I don't pay attention to anything that I've done, right? Or if I try and have a reverb of the same relationship that I had, I'm just escalating to a moment where it's not going to work out. The other reality is what I wanted at 25 and what I wanted at 39 were very different things. Sure. At least from my own personal preferences, how I want to spend my free time, the kinds of people I want to be around and interact with, and what I placed value had kind of shifted. So it's a combination of acknowledgement of those, of Josh Konowe at 25 and Josh Konowe at 39. And now, by the way, for the record, I'm 45, so there you go. And in conjunction with admitting that things that I had done probably contributed to, the downfall. So.
It's interesting. I sort of feel like since we're getting into it in detail, Shane asked or made a comment, which I thought we could comment on for a second, which was, he says, and thanks for this, by the way. From my perspective, with the relationships I have, I place no expectations on people, and that works well. And, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. My grandfather always used to say, he was not a very, wisdom-giving type of person.
Sure.
But he always used to say, don't set people up for failure. Don't create situations where the people you love are going to fail you. Is it possible to not have expectations from people?
I think it's possible to have, or it's possible to remove expectations that you have for yourself on other people. I'm not sure it's possible to take all expectations away from them, because, the sort of the definition of a relationship is give and take, right? And you have some expectation that they will give and that they will take, and how that dynamic, either, is modified over time or not. But to me, I think it would be, maybe you're in that headspace to be able to not have any expectations when you don't have an expectation for an outcome. So you're not looking for even adoration from a crowd. You do a public speaking event and then there's just dead silence. Nobody's clapping or laughing. That would be kind of the, on one end of the spectrum. And then the other one would be you live with this person or you run a business with this person and you're, day in and day out, like going through life together as a real partner. Then I think it's almost incumbent that you do actually have some expectations, but it's more about alignment. Like, what does the universe look like for 2 people or 10 people, whatever that situation is.
For sure. It's funny that you bring up public speaking because it's something that, I like to do a lot.
Yeah, you're wonderful at it.
Thank you so much. And so one of the things that I learned kind of early on, and it was really kind of jarring, but I remember it was really good advice. When you give speeches that are translated simultaneously, So when you're up there, you're talking and there are these translators and they're translating. Those translators are amazing. They do absolutely spectacular work and they're incredibly intelligent. It's an incredibly hard thing to do. As someone who speaks a number of languages, I can tell you couldn't do that simultaneous translation. But
Sure.
one of the things that happens in that translation is jokes and kind of pull quotes and points don't resonate the same way that they do when you're talking in your native language. And certainly the cultural context of, I'm a North American, and so the jokes that I tell are kind of put into that sort of context, and it's hard to repackage them for other people. And man, the first couple of foreign talks that I did that were translated, so much silence, like unbelievable amounts of silence. And it's really unnerving because you're not getting that feedback in real time. You're really just getting nothing. And nothing feels worse than no reaction. No reaction is like the worst of all possible reactions.
Right. So maybe the expectation, or to help finish this question, is that you have an expectation for yourself to get something from the other person. And even if they don't have an expectation of providing it, that you go out as far as you can to draw something back.
Well, don't you also think, though, like my observation, and I'd love to get your perspective, is I am incredibly critical of myself. I spend the vast majority of my time criticizing myself, and people have seen me, and certainly I've seen myself as judgy, in the world around me, and something that I'm definitely like working on. But the real judgment and the thing that many people don't grok is how I judge myself and the expectations that I have for myself, which were set, I guess, at a very early age and influenced by my parents. I'm my own harshest critic. How do you feel about expectations for yourself? What did you expect professionally and personally, and how does that work?
It's a great quality. So for your listeners and other folks that are out there, and not to promote Gabe and his, self-flatulating or whatever that is.
It's not flatulating. It's flagellating.
Flatulating.
Yeah. Low resolution audio could create some confusion.
Thank you.
All flatulation is self.
We took care of that later. Yeah. So anyway, I think the hardest thing to do is to learn to do that in a constructive way, right? Like you could just sit there and I'm terrible, and then all of a sudden you need like psychological help to unpack all of your problems that you may have caused. But it's an incredibly engendering quality for others to want to work with you. So, the example that I would give is, at least when I co-founded a company previously, they knew, okay, Josh is this like incredibly honest, direct, no BS, like lays it all out in front of you kind of guy. And I think even for investors, they were also, they were like uplifted a little bit because they know I'm just going to tell you exactly what's going on. And it was good for the co-founder relationship, at least that we had. And it was something that I didn't really learn until after, like by company 3, I had sort of gotten it like, okay, if I'm not busy, trying to, keep all the bad stuff inside, and I'm self-examining almost ad nauseum out in the public sphere, a little bit more, public being within the business, it brewed an incredible amount of trust very quickly, which is something that I've spoken about publicly as well. And I think doing that will inevitably get you better results. There's a point at which you can kind of beat yourself up too far, but I don't think people do it often enough. And even with small things, like, am I repeating what I say too frequently with people? Am I causing or injecting, consternation or problems where they don't really need to exist? Because if I just spent a little bit more time working on me, then they wouldn't arise, and I maybe would have less conflict overall.
Do you think sometimes that, and thanks for that question, by the way, Shane, or comment. Do you think that sometimes the forthrightness, the sort of honesty, is actually a bit of a deflection? Like, I have used honesty, I have used directness, it's a tool I can turn on or turn off. I have certainly used it as a way of like throwing people off the scent of my fear in a situation.
It's definitely jarring. And I think for people you are either working with or trying to work with, it can be very difficult for them to relate because they're not used to doing that. You know, all of the inclinations, and this is not to rip anybody apart for having an MBA, and going and working at a Fortune 500 company is to shut up and get in line and do as you're told and don't question and, just regurgitate. That's what we would like you to do and do it really, really professionally. And then, jumping into an entrepreneurial world, it's like, wait a minute, why aren't you telling me all these, I need to know everything. And I don't think enough of that is sort of understood. So it can cross the chasm between personal relationships and of course business relationships as well.
Did you have a time in your life, because I'm not sure I know this backstory, but do you have a time in your life where you did Fortune 500 stuff, like big companies?
Yes. So before 9/11, 9/11 was sort of like my watershed, both personal moment and scary moment and everything else. I was supposed to be in the North Tower the day that the first plane hit, and the South Tower the day after, but obviously there was no South Tower by then.
Yeah.
So I had this big reexamination of my career, my life, what I wanted to do. That's a different story for a different time. I'm sorry, repeat the question one more time.
No, so I was just curious about your transition from one to the other. So obviously, this is a recurring theme, by the way, that comes up on this show often about big changes and understanding failure is an external catalyst. Right. So somebody or some situation prompts you to reevaluate and rethink and address something that has been kind of sitting in the room. Sounds like you can relate to that.
I probably had 3 to 5 moments like that in my life. One of them would be 9/11, certainly. So before that, I never wanted to do anything except work for a big company. And I was at Euromoney PLC, and I was at Nielsen, and I was at Katz Radio Group, and I was always in and around, media, but with big companies, big relationships, and where I never had to worry about a paycheck. And then after 9/11, those buildings came horribly down. I just felt like, wow, if 102 story buildings and the 7 surrounding ones could come crashing down in a matter of hours, what does security really mean in my life? Why am I obsessed with tying myself to these things that can so easily just be taken away? And maybe it was a parallel that I didn't draw immediately, but over time it became one that I have started to really live by. And I have a 12-year-old son, and so I tell him these stories as well to pass them on. But he'll have to have his own jarring moments to get him to really become whoever he's going to be when he grows up. So, I feel like these are absolutely the change points, but I never wanted any insecurity prior to that moment.
It's interesting because there's this concept that I've spent a lot of time in my gamification design work, looking at the psychological concept called loss aversion. And one of the most interesting things about loss aversion, it's exactly what it sounds like. You don't want to lose things. One of the most interesting things about humans and loss aversion is that in general, a person is more averse to losing something that they already have than desirous of getting that thing in the first place. So once you have the thing, it's really stressful to imagine losing the thing, much more so than how much you wanted the thing in the first place. And I think for many people making the transition to entrepreneurship, I've met many folks who do this, Fortune 500. I did it for a very short period of time. They hated me. I hated them. It was great. But many people do that. And there's this security conversation. There's this idea of you see yourself being this corporate leader.
Right.
And then that sort of falls apart.
Yeah. For me, it was absolutely that. I never wanted to have a stress-driven kind of job. And that was brewed from my parents getting divorced at a very early age, both getting remarried, both getting divorced again, both getting remarried for a third time. Wow. So they're each on number 3. Yeah, and they have an incredible tree. We need at least another half an hour to go through that one. So good. So much failure.
Good.
Yeah. I'll let you talk to Judica and Lee. You can have another chat with them about it. But but because of that experience growing up as a divorced kid from age 7 onward, I only wanted to have a, little family and, nestle everything together and it's all going to work out and be perfect and just work for a big company, say yes all the time. And now I can't ever imagine really doing that.
Me neither. But it comes with a lot more risk. And in fact, one of
Sure.
the interesting, this question, it's been sitting out there for a while. Thanks for this question, JP. And I want to bring it up to you. JP asks, are we hardwired to fail? And
Yes.
say more about that.
I would say yes. And the reason I'm answering quickly, not to cut you off, is that, I think we treat failure as this evil thing in a language context and in a conceptual area in our brain. And because of how we're raised to try and succeed, right? Nobody wants to fail. That's why all the kids get trophies now. And, we're sort of architecting always to be successful rather than to be failing. But failing is actually this, and I struggle with kind of what is it? It's like, what's time, right? It's like this ethereal concept. It's hard to get your fingers around. But for me, failure it is only actually the process of learning. So I don't even reference it that way for myself. And I think that that's a good starting point for it.
I think most of the very, there's like two different kinds of successful people based on my kind of observation as I've been digging into this Failosophy combo. There's the group of people who spin their failures as necessary stepping stones for their future success. So I failed at this or this didn't work out, but that brought me to X. And then there's this other group that are like, the failure itself is the reason why I'm successful. And in the two of them, they're not mutually exclusive, but interestingly to me, in the two of them, there's like a slight difference in the way that those people are viewing the act of failure. So one of them is more fixated on, I think, their resilience, so their ability to get back up again, which is an important quality. But I wonder sometimes, and I'm curious to get your thought on this, is it resilience basically the symptom of a flawed way of thinking about failure?
I think I think you nailed it, actually. There's not a lot of further things I would add to that because, you have cause and effect, right, with so many things, and that is the effect that comes out of what happens. So, we live in a universe in many ways that is complicated and hard to interpret all the time, but there are some ones and zeros that you can sort of always count on in a binary context, and I think that this is one of them.
And I would say to JP's question, in a more specific sense, are we hardwired? Often I interpret as a kind of like neurobiological question. And
right.
There's a lot of work done on the dopaminergic system in the brain, how dopamine, and basically it's like the teaching chemical, right? When we do something challenging, we achieve that thing, we get a little bit of dopamine, and
right.
then in theory, when we do something and we fail at it, we don't. And one of the questions that I have, which isn't answered in the science, is whether or not in really successful people or people who are able to take risks over and over again, athletes, artists, serial entrepreneurs, would that cycle look different in the brain? Would you actually see dopamine being excreted from the mistakes as well as the successes?
I don't know, but that would be an interesting pattern to try and match.
I agree. Okay, so I did have like one sort of pointed question for you about about failure that I'm sort of curious about. So one of the vectors of failure that's been the hardest for me, I think, is the one where I have chosen to mentor or gone on a limb or bring someone into my orbit, either working for me or recommending them to work somewhere else and mentor them, and then them not working out, like making this connection and having that connection sort of not work, or bringing someone in and saying this person would be great for this role, and it actually isn't. It didn't work out, and for some reason this really kind of like gets at me. It really sort of turns the knife, and I feel like people
It turns to
must-
knife because you feel like it makes you a bad teacher, or you made a bad decision, or both.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it as being like I made a bad call and then I didn't do what I needed to do to help that person bridge the gap. And of course, I have my successes there as well, but the failures really stick out. Like I can instantly be
Sure.
like, these are the 3 or 4 people that were just a fucking disaster. What do you make of that? I feel like you're somebody that many people would like them to mentor.
Yeah. Well, I definitely get asked similarly, both like in a advisory style role, or hey, I'm a friend and I just need some help with something. And then I get it on the other side too, being a boss or working with someone. And the hardest part for me is that, it just feels like you wasted a lot of energy and time trying to get them to be something or have them have the light bulb go off. And I think what I've started to come away with is you can't really know that this person is going to work out, and that, like other relationships that you have, even though this one is more of a teaching and hand-holding and guiding kind of role, it's kind of incumbent upon you as the entrepreneur and the leader of the ship to do this anyway, and that you will have people who, as you're, the bad metaphor of like rowing across the ocean in the 16th century, they're just going to die and you need to throw them over the board or let the other people eat them or, whatever that is. But,
we went to cannibalism pretty quickly in this conversation. That was unexpected.
It could be a little bit like that in startups. So, I'm not despondent about it because I put the energy and the effort forth, and whether they listen or they don't listen is really kind of up to them. Inevitably, what I find though too, when I either hear from them later, like a couple years later, they'll say things like, "Oh, you always did this one thing and it's just stuck with me," or you were so patient while I was doing X or Y, and I never really got mad, even though I was frustrated that you had to let me go or whatever had happened. And to me, it seems like, okay, I didn't get them, like I got them from here to like here, but I didn't get them to there, which is
Right.
what I was hoping to have happen. But maybe somebody else is going to help fill in the rest of the gap for that individual. And if they want that to happen, then they will take the torch or whatever and carry it themselves. So I try not to let it irk me.
We met early on in a kind of mentorship context, I think, right, at Founder Institute in DC, when I came down to do some mentorship. How do you feel about the companies that you've helped or the people that you've helped over the years, and your track record with being able to assess whether or not they're going to work out or they're not going to work out? Because one of the things that I often have struggled with is I've made a few like angel investments over the years in startups that I've been very excited about, particularly when I was running Founder Institute in New York. But I've often sort of, framed myself as not being good at telling the successes apart from the failures in early days. I get really excited, I get really emotional, and I don't see the sort of whole picture. How do you feel about your ability to pick winners and losers?
I feel like it's so hard to get this right. And even with, the advent of having amazing VCs that we're always surrounded by and others that talk about their successes, they don't get it right 90-something% of the time either. And the only thing I've gotten better at is frankly smelling bullshit, from a lot further away than I did before. It was like, no, it's right on your nose, but I think I wanted to try and do too many things for too many folks earlier on, and I've just gotten a little bit better at saying, like this isn't time appropriate, or doing what a lot of venture capitalists and others I think sort of smartly have figured out, which is just wait. If you wait long enough, the successes will sort of start coming to you more and more frequently, and other people will keep helping to bring them to bear, and leaning on the rest of the universe to help you make decisions is something we probably don't do enough of often at that angel level. And I've blown money on dumb investments and one or two that made it, and I'm like, no idea. Right. I didn't think you were going to make it. But
which one of those scenarios is more difficult, do you think, for you to deal with? personally, the ones in which you missed out on an opportunity, so you thought they were not worth it and did not invest, and then they turned out to succeed, were the ones where you put the money in, you were really excited about it, and then it didn't work out?
Well, always the latter, right? I mean, sure, it's great to be like I missed the boat, or I was in early, I had an opportunity at Uber or Facebook or Google or whatever. But, I don't really have that level of awesomeness or access personally. So I've had, only a handful of opportunities to get in early. And it was more like, do I have enough, to play ball? On the other side of the fence, it's like, yeah, I was sure, it like had the right team and, the right mojo, and the secret sauce was at the right time in the world for it to be accepted widely and quickly. And then it just went, whoa, thud.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
Just a small anecdote before we wrap up. 10 or 11 years ago, a good friend of mine, she's not technology oriented. Maybe it was 9 or 10 years ago. She's not super technology oriented. Came to me. I'm the resident nerd in our circle. So she, dear friend, she came to me and she's like, "Hey, do you think we should buy Apple stock?" And I was like, this was after the introduction of the iPod and maybe after the iPhone, like right around that time. And I was so skeptical. I leaned in on being conservative for her sake, and I was like really skeptical, and I was like, no, I don't go too long on Apple. Like, the things move quickly. I don't know if this probably isn't going to work out. And I had like, my list of reasons. And she likes to tease me now with, "I'm glad I didn't listen to you," because they made like a huge pile of money by having bought the stock at that time.
Well, the most mature failure you can have in those contexts is to say you were right. And I'm glad to have been wrong and that you didn't listen to me, because none of us are soothsayers, right? We're not oracles. We're just people.
Right. I think that's a great practice. I'm glad to have been wrong for you.
Yes.
Josh, so good to see you. Thank you for coming on. Folks can follow you at JKONOWE on Twitter. It's a fascinating ride. Follow Josh at every opportunity. And thanks to all of you for watching and listening. Remember, you can get the Failosophy podcast on iTunes and Stitcher and Google Play. And you can see a video version of it or an audio version of it. It's up to you. And typically I come to you Wednesday or Thursday in the middle of the day to talk about failure with some of my favorite people, brilliant people like Josh. Thank you so much, Josh. Thanks,
everybody. Thanks, Gabe.
If you enjoyed this episode, click subscribe, leave a review, share with your friends, and come back next week for more real talk about failure. And remember, if you're not on the precipice of failure right now, you're not living to your full potential. This has been Failosophy with Gabe Zichermann.